are so excited to be joined by Bills color analyst, former center Eric Wood, joining the show right now. Eric, thanks for coming on.
For sure. Glad to be on with you guys. Excited to get this season rolling.
I know it is crazy that week one is here. We've had an entire offseason to digest Buffalo's moves. We've got to see the Bills in training camp, now preseason. As we sit right now on Monday before the Bills kick off their season on Sunday night against the Ravens, where are you at with this Bills team, Eric?
I'm excited. And look, the injuries were the story of most of the preseason, and the Bills have gotten hit by the injury bug, and it hasn't stopped. We saw that Dwayne Carter is going to be out for the season with an Achilles, but this is still a super talented Bills team that was on the cusp of making the Super Bowl a year ago, one of the betting favorites to make the Super Bowl this year. So it's an exciting start to the season. You start off with one of the other best teams in the NFL, the Baltimore Ravens, who returned most of their roster as well. It's going to look like a familiar matchup when we see these teams face off Sunday night that we saw face off twice a year ago.
I said this about a week ago, that this may be the most talented roster since the 90s, but, and with yourself, no disrespect to you, but some of the, like the 03 roster, I mean, there's a big drought in the middle of those two rosters. And, there were some star players and some really good athletes on those teams, but top to bottom, this roster may be the most talented and deep since those early 90s. You got, and with finger quotes, a huge caveat, if they're healthy, right? If Joey Bosa's on the field, if Trey White's on the field, if Max Harrison, Christian Benford, Milano, Bernard, all those, and all the young guys on, and of course offensively, this may be the most talented team that they've put together, even in the Sean McDermott era. And of course, you've got the little 200-pound weight of Josh Allen, on at the top of the scales, right? But it really is a talented and deep roster. But as you said, you can't predict how many guys are actually going to finish the race at the end of the season.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I agree with you. And give credit to Brandon Beane and his staff and the Pagulas for fronting the money, because this team's done a great job of retaining the talent that they've drafted. The story of the offseason was the guys that they were able to bring back and re-sign. This is this new core, and you talk about the talent, it's tremendous. And then you add additions like Josh Palmer, you add additions like Joey Bosa, Michael Hoyt, who I'm extremely excited about. You go out and draft all those young defensive players that we've seen throughout the preseason, and hopefully Max Harrison, after 4 or so weeks, will come back and make an impact on this defense. But the talent level of this roster, I agree with you. It's as high as it's been, and a big reason of that is the draft, develop, re-sign philosophy of Brandon Beane and his staff.
Tasker, you mentioned it, this roster, but where the team is at right now, you've got some injuries looming. We haven't heard from Sean McDermott yet, so we're not quite sure about the status of some of these guys who didn't finish out the preseason, guys who we maybe didn't see in the last 2 preseason games. So as we sit right now, it's kind of like, who's going to be available for this week 1 game? It's not like Buffalo has a tune-up game for week 1. No, bam, they're playing against the Baltimore Ravens, the team they beat in the AFC divisional round last season. The Ravens are going to be out for blood too in this week 1 game. They want to take down the Buffalo Bills. And when you look at the magnitude of what this game could mean at the end of the season, I mean,
it puts you 2 games behind the 1 seed.
Holy moly.
I mean, you got to think they're going to be right there too.
This is a big deal. So when you talk about all of this, how do these injuries worry you? What is going through your mind when you kind of think of, well, maybe the Bills won't be at full strength with some of these guys possibly missing week 1?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest issue is the defensive secondary, and Taylor Rapp and Cole Bishop were able to play towards the end of the preseason, or at least be back at practice, but we saw them in a limited capacity. And then you have Christian Benford and Tre'Davious White going down both in the same training camp or the same practice, I guess, leading up to the Bucs game. So we got to see where the cornerbacks are at. The safeties didn't get a lot of time on task. This is a tough matchup week 1 when you consider how those guys have to fit in the run game. And then you also have Lamar Jackson and what he was able to do through the air a year ago and how he's developed as a passer. So I would say the secondary is the position that scares me the most when you look at all these injuries. Now, when we got the brakes beat off us last year early in the season at Baltimore in week 4, that whole second level of the defense was out. You had Milano out, Bernard out, Taron Johnson out. All indications those guys are going to be ready to go. And that makes a huge difference. And that made a difference in the second matchup in the playoffs. But you're right. I mean, this is a game that's likely going to play a huge role in what happens with that number one seed at the end of the season. And you hate to be dinged up going into it, but look, I mean, everybody's going to get dinged up throughout the season. Each team's going to be affected by injuries. You just hope that, maybe the Bills caught theirs during training camp, get these guys healthy. Shakir was back in uniform last week at practice. So, you likely get him back. And offensively, you're in a much better health spot. And so it might be a deal early on with the suspensions and some of the injuries on defense that the offense has got to carry the load.
And you know better than most people what you're watching when we're looking at the preseason games. We got all these young defensive linemen. You got Landon Jackson, Deion Walker, TJ Sanders. How good are they?
That's a great question. We got to see them in actual uniform, in playing against starters and all of that. All of them have flashed at times. I thought Landon Jackson got better as the preseason went on, as he got more reps through the preseason. It seemed like, he just had a better plan. And that happens, Steve. You know that from, you go from training camp practices, and then it's a ramp up to the preseason games, and then it's another ramp up to the regular season. So we got to see these guys in action. Deion Walker has flashed at times, and Sanders has as well. So you love to see those high ceiling type plays from those guys where you say, okay, this is where they can play at. Now, how consistently can they do it when it matters is what we'll see coming up. But there's been a lot to be excited about from all three of those young defensive linemen, from how they flashed throughout the preseason. Now we got to see how can they do it. And look, none of the three of those guys are likely going to be starters, come week one. But the way we roll our defensive line in and out, those guys are going to play significant snaps, especially now that Dwayne Carter's out of the mix with the Achilles injury. That's even more reps that's going to be on those guys' plate. But, I had one of the guys that I knew the most about coming into the draft was Deion Walker, just simply the fact that I played at Louisville. He played at University of Kentucky. I don't watch a ton of college football anymore, I'll admit it. It's getting harder and harder to follow it with the transfers and NIL and all that. But I saw that dude for a number of years at UK, and he was always impressive, and he was a guy that I was excited about. And I had Connor McGovern on my podcast last week, and we talked about him specifically, and he said, man, he's like a big ballerina. You think he's just going to, thud you on each play because he's 6'7", 340, and he's got some wiggle to him. So to say I'm most excited about him, maybe that's how I feel right now, but I think all three of those guys can and should make an impact this season.
Yeah, it was really fun to watch Deion Walker push the pocket a little bit in those preseason games. Speaking of preseason football, you got a chance to call 3 of those games, watch the team, watch the entire roster now cut down to 53. What surprised you most about Bills preseason football this year?
Well, I'll say this. I mean, I think Sean did a great job of, okay, we're going to take this joint practice to Chicago, get the work that we want with our starters, especially Josh, and then, hey, we're going to throttle back on how much we play those guys. And, I think part of it is you get dinged up that much during training camp practices. You don't want to risk any of the other guys. So, were there some lowlights throughout the preseason? Of course. And, that's going to happen at times when you play, your backups against their starters, and then, your backups that might be getting 12, 15 team reps a practice. Now they're playing 30 reps, and now the other team's backups are coming in and they're a little bit worn down. So, of course, there were some lowlights throughout the preseason. Fun to end the way they did against Tampa Bay, and, guys like Shane Buechele and, probably the guy, this doesn't come as any surprise, and I've heard you guys talk about him a ton, but just so excited for Shavers and what he was able to do throughout the preseason, earn that roster spot, show that he's capable of playing on special teams, towards the later part of the preseason. So extremely excited about him. But, as far as surprises go, I don't want to say it's a surprise, but maybe most impressed with the way that Shavers would have been able to go out and earn a spot, not fall into a spot, not have injuries at the wide receiver position that, landed him on the roster. It's fun watching a guy like him go out and just truly earn a roster spot through the preseason games.
One of the things we noticed as well, and you're talking about the offensive side of the ball and the wide receivers, was a different kind of Keon Coleman. His attitude was different. His demeanor was different. His production was way more consistent this year. If he turns out to be the guy he looked like in training camp, what does that mean? How does that, take this offense and how's it help it evolve? Because certainly they're going to spread the football around. Shakir's still going to get his targets. Kincaid and Knox are going to get their targets. Certainly James Cook's going to get his touches. But with a Keon Coleman out there, how does that change the balance of this offense, if at all?
Yeah, when you draft a guy that's 6'4" with a basketball background, you hope that in year 2 through training camp, you're going to see what you saw from Keon Coleman throughout those training camp practices and throughout the preseason. And if he can be the guy, if he can, piggyback what he did throughout the preseason and take it into the regular season, he could take this offense to another level. The one thing they were missing last year was a guy that can pull those safeties out of the boxes, can be your deep threat down the field, can be that physical guy in the red zone that you say, okay, you're one-on-one, this is our guy on the play. And he could truly be that for the Bills. We got to see it in games, but, he's going up against Christian Benford and Tre'Davious White and those guys during training camp. That's pretty awesome cornerback duo that he's gotten to go against throughout the preseason. And then he lit up the Bears secondary throughout the joint practice. So I'm excited to see what Keon could be. And this is what they hoped they were going to get in year 2 in that development. And, he got the injury last year, and Sean McDermott and Brandon Bead said, hey, he didn't come back off the injury well, and we need to see maybe more commitment. We need to see more toughness, whatever it was they wanted to see from him. They're seeing it now, and I'm excited to see what he can do in this early part of the season.
Yeah, it's not just Keon Coleman either. You look at the offense as a whole and some of the playmakers on the offense, and you think about other playmakers taking a step forward in Dalton Kincaid and figuring out where does Curtis Samuel fit in Buffalo's offense. I know he missed most of training camp in the preseason again, but that's something they're going to work really hard to figure out. Eric, when you look at what the Bills have in the wide receiver room, the tight end room, how do you expect Joe Brady to take a step forward in his second full season as Buffalo's offensive coordinator?
Yeah, I think at the end of the season last year, a lot of the talk was about how can we get more big plays, not have to sustain those 12, 13, 14 play drives. How can we make it a little bit easier to score points at times? And so you bring in a Josh Palmer who certainly has some separation ability. You have that deep threat in Keon Coleman, and he's making plays all throughout the preseason. And then it's well documented that Dalton Kincaid played a lot of last year with a dinged up knee and really had to fight through. So you have so many playmakers. It's going to be that same everybody eats philosophy on offense, which fantasy football owners don't love because you don't know, is this going to be a game where, they keep the safeties high and James Cook runs the ball 25 times and they, churn out the game on the ground, or do they bring the safeties down? And it might be a Shakir one week. It might be a Palmer. It might be a Samuel. It might be Keon Coleman. And that's the luxury that the Bills have, that they have so many different guys that can make plays. It's just tough to predict week to week who's going to be the guy that's going to be the focal point. Now, you got the league MVP and Josh Allen, so you could say there's your focal point. But outside of him, who's going to be the one catching those balls? For fantasy owners, they don't love it, but week to week, it could be someone different each week.
All right, so you played offensive line. You know how brutal a way that is to make a living. They've lost one player for one game over the last 2 years. Spencer Brown missed the Chiefs game last year in a 9-point win. Other than that, all 5 guys take every snap that the team wants them to. Now, in a blowout win, they've sat them down and stuff like that and rotated them in and out. But, man, when they needed them, those guys, all 5 of them, have always been there for 2 years. How likely is that to happen this year?
Knock on wood.
I would say not. Yeah, knock on wood. Here we go. I would say, the law of averages would say it likely doesn't happen. But, I don't want to give too much credit to coaching and scheme because some of it's purely luck to stay healthy throughout 17 regular season games. But, this is a group that doesn't throw guys into each other. And that's a lot of what Aaron Cromer talks about. Hey, if you're going to put a guy down, you can't go laterally throughout the line. And that's kind of getting into the weeds of things. But, these guys have done a great job of keeping their bodies healthy, staying available. And just because you don't miss games doesn't mean you're not dinged up throughout the season. Doesn't mean you're might not be playing through something. So give those guys some credit for being tough enough to, push through some things throughout the season that maybe other guys on other teams don't push through. But when you're able to return everybody from a line that played at such a high level last year, Josh had the least amount of sacks in the league, one of the highest yards before contact with James Cook throughout the season. When you're able to return all those guys in that chemistry and continuity, it's extremely valuable.
Eric, looking at the Bills and the Ravens matchup, last season the Bills and Ravens both averaged over 30 points per game. On defense, they both allowed around 21 points per game. I mean, these two teams were very close, played very different football in terms of how they scored their points, but they were really close when you look at the stat sheet. This offseason, the Bills add to their defensive line, add a couple more playmakers. On the Baltimore side of things, they add Malachi Starks in the draft, a really great safety out of Georgia, also beef up their secondary in different ways. How do you view this matchup between these two teams who changed a little bit in the offseason, but really not too much?
Yeah, when you have two teams that were as solid as both these were, you don't feel like you have to change a whole lot. Now you're always trying to upgrade your roster and continue to get better, but they didn't need to do a ton, and you saw that from both of them. The offensive side of the football primarily intact for both teams. They had DeAndre Hopkins at receiver. We had Joshua Palmer, and so going to be pretty similar on both sides of the ball. And when you got two teams like this that can both score touchdowns, both solid defenses, a lot of times it comes down to turnovers, big plays. And in the first game last year, we saw the game start off with that long Derrick Henry run, and we weren't able to make the plays in that one. And then the second one, we win the turnover battle 3-0, and that's kind of the biggest factor in that second game. And so when you look at teams that are evenly matched like this, it's who can make the big plays, who can win the turnover battle, do penalties and special teams play a factor? Because offensive and defensively, these are two pretty evenly matched teams.
Thanks, man. It's good to see you. We'll catch you up with you throughout the season, and have a great call on Sunday night.
I appreciate it. Always great being on with you guys.